you said that Lockheed has possession of this machine that can do this, that can manipulate time, and they are going forward in time and manipulating the timeline. Who is doing this?
I hope Lockheed isn't doing it. No, I wasn't trying to suggest that they are.
Well, how do you know that this timeline is being manipulated? How do you know that? And who do you think is doing it?
There is a researcher, Michael Cremo, who wrote a book with a guy called Richard Thompson. Thompson's a PhD in, I forget which scientific field. The book was called Forbidden Archaeology. It's a tome. It's about this thick. It's in the same general area, same general vein of research as Graham Hancock and Robert Bauval and Robert Schoch, people who study deep history, prehistory, archaeological remains from prehistory that challenge our accepted views of the historical timeline, right? Except Cremo and Thompson's work in Forbidden Archaeology is more radical insofar as they go through the history of scientific journals back into the 1800s, and they show how many discoveries there were, reported by very prestigious publications, of clearly engineered structures and artificial objects stuck in geological strata that are millions of years old. Like polished concrete walls in a stratum that dates to, 200 million years ago. Or gold chains, jewelry that's at a geological stratum of 60 million years ago. There are tens and tens of these discoveries that they present in this book that were in prominent scientific journals, and then slowly in the 20th century were filtered out of what it was acceptable to publish, given what became the standard human history taught in the academies. Mm-hmm. So there are a couple of different ways you could look at that. One is you could imagine that even though there's not much of a fossil record for it, humanity goes back hundreds of millions of years on this planet. I doubt that very much. Because again, there isn't a fossil record for it. We find dinosaur bones all the time. We don't find large populations of humans that are contemporaneous with, the Jurassic period. The other way that you could interpret those findings, though, is that human time travelers, on a very limited basis, were living in those epochs and left artifacts behind. So that's one line of empirical evidence that you could use to argue for time travel.
So you're saying that this could have been happening in the 1800s?
No. What I'm saying is that up to the 1800s, these things were reported on in scientific journals, right? Like up to the 1800s, you had Smithsonian Institution and whatever reporting on a gold locket found in a geological stratum that dates to 60 million BC.
Yes.
Right? There are lots of these finds.
But we don't know about those anymore.
We have those journals. We have access to those journals.
We still have access to
Absolutely.
the journals.
My point is, Cremo and Thompson, they wrote this tome, Forbidden Archaeology, where they go through all of this evidence. They present case after case. And they have their own interpretation of what this means, okay? Because they come from a kind of Vedantic, that's the book. They come from a kind of Vedantic background. They subscribe to a form of Vedic religion. And in the Hindu religion, there is the notion that there are these vast cycles of time. They call them yugas, the ages, right? And we're in the last of them now, supposedly the Kali Yuga. But the whole cycle begins with the Satya Yuga, the golden age, and then it goes to a silver age. And the Greeks had the same thing, silver age, bronze age, until you get to our present time, which is supposed to be the last of the world ages. And this whole cycle then repeats itself. So Cremo and Thompson come from the school of thought that, look, humanity has always existed, and we are living in a fallen world, we're living in a degraded age, and we've lost our knowledge of previous ages of higher civilization. And they think this goes way, way back, like that humanity existed in its present form tens and tens of millions of years ago. I don't agree with their interpretation of their own evidence. I think that that's a religious belief system, which they subscribe to. And my much more radically empiricist, pragmatic approach to the data they're presenting is to say the best way to make sense out of this is that these artifacts were left behind by human time travelers, and that the past is contaminated by the future.
I see what you're saying. So that stuff could have been left by people that are even before us or after us right now.
Exactly. And to me, this is one of the reasons.
Wow.
This is one of the reasons why, or one of the ways.
This
in
is
which,
sort of the sorry to interrupt. This is sort of the opposite. Graham Hancock's idea is that there was a crazy advanced civilization that got wiped out by comets, and we hit a reset button. You're saying this advanced civilization was from the future.
Exactly. I started reading Graham Hancock when I was maybe 15. I read all of the books that he had published, back then in the late 90s. But then I did a lot more research. And see, the thing is, when you're coming from out of a background in philosophy, you have to engage with all kinds of different research domains.
Yes.
And one of the problems with anthropological researchers like Hancock, or on the other hand, UFO researchers, whether they're coming from a physics background or, I don't know, from a sociology background or whatever, is that they stay only within their own research domain and they don't look at what's going on in other fields. They're not interdisciplinary enough. And my work has been radically interdisciplinary from the beginning. So I've been able to cross-correlate different bodies of data. And one of the things that Graham Hancock talks about, which I find very compelling, is the evidence for Antarctica having been Atlantis. In his first book, Fingerprints of the Gods, where he's drawing from the earlier research of Rand Flemeth, he makes this, and Charles Hapgood. Flemeth's work was dependent on this historian, Charles Hapgood, who I think taught at Boston College back in the day. And Hapgood had this theory that, and by the way, Hapgood worked with the CIA for a time, so he was like a government-funded scientist. And Hapgood had this theory that, to oversimplify it, in the course of the various ice ages, the Earth becomes top-heavy. And at a certain point, the ice sheet pulls on the mantle of the Earth.
Yeah.
And it causes it to slip. It causes the surface of the Earth to slip over the mantle, like this loose skin of an orange. And that in some cyclical fashion, every, I don't know, maybe 12,000 years or so.
Pole shift.
Well, there's a shifting of the pole in the sense that by 3,000 or 4,000 kilometers, the location of the pole shifts. Not like drastically, like the Earth flips over or anything like that.
Right.
By a few thousand kilometers, which means that, let's say circa 12,000 years ago, 10,500 BC or so, the Younger Dryas period, Antarctica would have been mostly where Argentina is today and had mostly the climate of Argentina today, except one side of Antarctica would have been already inside the South Polar region. And we have evidence for this because apparently in Antarctica, the ice sheet is not thickest where you'd expect it would be, right at the South Pole. The ice sheet is thickest in the part of Antarctica that would already have been in the South Pole prior to the slippage of the crust.
Right.
Because it was the place where, there was already massive snowfall and so forth. See? So, and we also have evidence for this in Siberia in terms of this flash flooding and then freezing of the mammoths who they froze so quickly that they have undigested food in their stomachs, right?
That's where the Younger Dryas flower.
Right. So, but here's where I'm going with this, is that I think there's a lot of compelling evidence for the fact that Atlantis, or whatever we want to call this civilization that Plato writes about.
Yeah.
Plato says it was destroyed 9,000 years before his time, which lines up with, Hancock and Boval and Robert Schoch's
12,000
research.
years ago,
yeah, because 12,000 years ago, the three pyramids on the Giza Plateau line up perfectly with the three stars of Orion's belt, and the Sphinx is looking at its counterpart, the constellation of Leo, as it rises into the sky
At the dawn.
at the dawn on the spring equinox. Exactly. So that gives us a timestamp for when the Giza Plateau monuments were planned, right? But no, here's where I'm going with it, is somewhere much more interesting that has to do with time travel. If Atlantis was Antarctica, and they had such a high level of civilization, right? How high a level? How high a level? Look at the Baalbek platform in Lebanon. The stones in the pyramid, the Great Pyramid, which we still can't figure out how the hell these things were moved and positioned, they're in the hundreds of ton range. The biggest ones are in the hundreds of tons. At Baalbek in Lebanon, there is a platform which consists of three 1,300-ton stones. They're 1,200 to 300 tons a piece.
Yeah, we've gone over these on the. Can you pull up those Baalbek
And they
monoliths?
are raised on top of a 40-foot platform of smaller megaliths, right? Which, like, who does that? I mean, if you're going to drag stones this big, wouldn't you use them as the foundation course and then put smaller stones on top? No. These people apparently decided to show off by lifting these 1,300-ton stones, these trilithons, and putting them on top of smaller megalithic stones. And again, just like at Giza, just like at Tiwanaku in Bolivia, just like at various sites in Peru.
Look, is that one of them?
Yeah, well, no, look, that one that's just by itself.
The second one in the middle, yeah, with the red lines. Yeah, zoom in on that.
Yes, but I want you to go back to the other one too. Yeah, you can see the scale of a person next to those. Look at the one above there, how small a person is next to those.
Go up.
Yeah, look at that. Look at the scale of that. But if you could go back to that one that was buried.
Oh, the
yeah, okay,
guy?
right there,
That
okay?
one.
Now that is in the quarry where these stones came from.
Yeah.
That quarry is 50 miles away from the site.
Yes.
50 miles. How did they take 1,300 ton stone? 19 cranes of the highest industrial grade that we have today can't lift and move one of these. They've done the engineering calculations. How did they move that thing 50 miles? You know why that's buried there? Because they wanted to tell us that that's where the quarry was, and that they've somehow managed to move that stone 50 miles to build the platform at Baalbek. All right, here's my point. That gives you a sense of the level of engineering capability of this civilization. It's beyond ours.
Way beyond ours.
Way beyond ours.
The problem is there's no saw blades or toasters or anything in the desert out there.
And there's no large-scale evidence for this civilization other than these megalithic structures.
Nothing.
In various places in the world. You know where I think there's going to be a jackpot of a plethora of evidence for it? Under the ice of Antarctica. And here's where I'm going with this. If you're a civilization that advanced, why do you isolate yourself to Antarctica? Why would you do that?
Right.
You tell me. Any thoughts why you would do something like that?
Why you would isolate yourself?
Yeah, you have this level of technology, right? And after the cataclysm, you go around the world and you build these various megalithic sites, which leave a record of the level of your technical achievement.
How do we know it was after the cataclysm?
Well, we know Giza was after the cataclysm.
We do?
Yeah, I mean, the ground plan dates to 10,500 BC. And if you line that up with Plato, and you line it up with the end of the Ice Age and the massive flooding, it's just after that cataclysm that site was built. Also...
You're talking about the Great Pyramid.
Yes. The three pyramids and the Sphinx, and there are other structures like the Osirian at Abydos in Egypt that are all in the same style. They're all in this anonymous, high-precision megalithic style.
What did you say was the evidence that it happened 10,000 BC?
Well, the Giza ground plan, like we were just talking about.
The Giza ground plan.
Yeah, the alignment of the three stars of Orion, Orion's belt with the three pyramids, and the alignment of the Sphinx with its counterpart on the horizon, that gives us an astrological date of the age of Leo.
Yes.
And that happens to be right after the Great Flood took place, right? Through the melting of the ice sheets.
Between 12,900 years ago and
Roundabout
there's like
then.
1,000-year period there in the Younger Dryas.
Exactly. And this is, again, also when Plato tells us Atlantis was destroyed. But if you go to South America, the Mayans also say that the people who built these megalithic structures, the people of Quetzalcoatl, that the people of the feathered serpent, they came there after the Great Flood. That's what they say. And they started making these constructions there and teaching the locals agriculture and trying to restart civilization in various ways. So it also aligns with what the myths tell us. Now, my question is this. If you have that level of technology, why would you isolate yourself to Antarctica? Antarctica is a place that's completely isolated. Think about it, right? All the oceans of the world, the Atlantic Ocean, Pacific Ocean, Indian Ocean, they meet around Antarctica, and it's sort of hidden away from all the other continents of the planet to the extent that we did not discover it until like the 1800s, except, of course, it's on a few anomalous maps. The Piri Reis map and the Orontius Phineas map and so on and so forth. But we didn't find, in our modern Western civilization, we didn't find the damn continent until the 1800s.
Did they think it was safer there?
Here's what I think. If they were time travelers, they needed to isolate themselves from the timeline. If you were coming from the year 2200 or the year 3500, and for whatever reason you needed to reach back into the deep past of humanity, right? Let's say Earth suffers some horrendous cataclysm, or let's say they fought a war with an enemy that vanquished them, and their only retreat was backwards in time, to hide in time. You might be motivated by some kind of, noble intention not to mess with the human timeline to the extent that you can avoid it. And initially, you might decide to quarantine yourself to a place where you're not going to be observed by the other evolving societies on Earth. And Antarctica would be the ideal place from which to do that on this planet.
Wow.
So I think under that ice in Antarctica, we're going to find the jackpot. The elites in various societies that are engineering wars and pursuing a policy of divide and conquer for control over large populations on this planet seem to all be involved with these entities. They seem to all be involved with what the Sumerians call Anunnaki, or what the Greeks called the Olympian gods, or with what the Bible describes as the Elohim, which, by the way, it's a plural. People think Elohim in the Bible means God. They translate it as God. It means the gods. Yahweh is Adonai Elohim, the chief of the gods, the same way that Zeus is the chief of the Olympians.
Okay, but do you think Dick Cheney was talking to the aliens, or do you think he just wanted to make a ton of fucking money?
I think George Bush Sr. was.
Yeah, but
Junior was a moron. We know that.
Yes.
Junior.
But Dick Cheney, the guy behind the Iraq War,
remember,
who owned...
Listen, Dick Cheney worked with George Bush Sr. George Bush Sr. put Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld around Junior. All right? Sr. told Cheney and Rumsfeld, take care of Junior. We have to do certain things. And you know how Junior is. I need you guys with him. They were from George Bush Sr.'s administration. And when I say George Bush Sr.'s administration... Yeah, and when I say George Bush Sr.'s administration, I mean also what he was doing to undermine Ronald Reagan during Reagan's entire presidency. Reagan did not want George Bush as his vice president. He thought he was a total creep, coming from out of the CIA. He had been former director of the CIA, and he's a 33rd degree Freemason. George Bush Sr. was 33rd degree Mason. And his grandfather was Hitler's financier in America, Prescott Bush. So Bush Sr., yes. Bush Sr., I think, is someone who literally has at some point sat down with these 7-foot-tall Nordic people and had policy planning conversations with them. I wouldn't be surprised at all. And so what Bramley found is that you had that kind of thing going on throughout human history with various elites in Sumer, in Greece, in Rome.
What leads you to believe that? What is the most convincing evidence for you that George Bush Sr. had meetings with Nordic beings?
I don't see why he wouldn't. I mean, if George Adamski is...
You don't see why he wouldn't.
Yeah, look, when David Grush came out and talked about all these reverse engineering efforts that are underway, right? One of the most interesting things that he said was that not all of these craft were retrieved from crash sites. Some of them were what they now call donations. Okay? Meaning there were cases where we have been handed intact craft. That's been confirmed by a number of people other than David Grush.
When they say donations, isn't he saying that these things would crash, they're so sophisticated and so advanced, they wouldn't crash by accident. They would crash them on purpose to help stimulate human society and stimulate our innovation. Take this and see if you can figure it out.
Yeah, no, I don't think so.
I thought that's what he was saying.
No. There is no way in hell that a civilization that advanced would volunteer this kind of technology to any stratum of the U.S. government without an extremely detailed agreement having been reached. And that would have to have been negotiated by both sides.
But if you're so advanced, why would you want to, like, we don't go to the Congo.
No, it's not. They're not. It's not like that, man. They're not like so advanced. And this is one of the most dangerous assumptions that people make, that we're dealing with like some kind of ethereal beings that have such a vast cosmic horizon of understanding. It's much more like when colonial elites encountered savage or primitive populations, like when the British Empire or the Portuguese were out conquering very undeveloped societies, right? By comparison to the people in those societies, including their chieftains or their shamans or whatever, those colonizers were gods. And we even had like cargo cults, arise in Polynesia and the Pacific, where the islands that the British would land their planes on wound up being the site for cults of like straw planes made by these natives to pray for the British to come back because they're gods. And what I suggest to you, this is a rather grim assessment, but what I suggest to you is that the people who are flying around in these anti-gravity craft are not any more ethical than British colonialists or Nazi Germans in North Africa. They have more advanced technology. That doesn't necessarily mean they have any more of a sense of beneficence or humanistic ethics than any of the colonial elites in our own history have. Right? After all, if you look
so it's like us compared to hunter-gatherers, like us technologically civilized human beings in Western society compared to like an uncontacted tribe.
Yeah, and disturbingly, if you look at our own history, our recorded history, what we've been allowed to know of history, there's a direct correlation between scientific and technological advancement and brutality. The more technologically, scientifically advanced societies are the more brutal and more exploitative ones. Why would we assume that if the trajectory continues into the future, things would be any different?
Right. No, I agree with that. And at the same time, I've thought about this before. We've talked about this on the podcast before, but we can exist right here in America, whether you're being in New York or Los Angeles, in taking autonomous vehicles to different places, using these phones that could connect you with anyone, anywhere in the world, see them on video, right, in a second. At the same time, simultaneously, there are other places in the world where people are running around naked.
Yeah.
So why wouldn't it go the same way into the future? Why couldn't we be as primitive to a whole nother civilization of beings as those uncontacted tribes are to us?
My point exactly. But here's the ethical problem that I struggle with as a philosopher. Why is it like that if a group of humans have passed the technological singularity, right? If a certain group of humans developed the level of genetic engineering, nanotech, artificial intelligence that we ourselves are going to have 20 years from now, why didn't they raise the rest of humanity up with them? Yes. Moreover, why are they reaching back through time to very deliberately oppress and manipulate more primitive societies?
Well, why don't we try to elevate those uncontacted tribes? Well, because every time we go around them and try to interfere with what they're doing, we get killed. They shoot arrows at us.
Sure. But, maybe they should have shot more arrows at the British, right, in some of these places. My point is that that's a very beneficent motivation on their part, meaning, okay, these are violent, crazy savages. We don't want to get, shot down by these people. What fits the data, if you look at, how various societies going back to the Sumerians were governed, is a much more explicit and active agenda of manipulation. And the manipulation is geared toward setting up a pyramidal caste society, an extremely stratified society where, the vast majority of people are the base of the pyramid, and then an ever smaller group of people represent higher rungs until you get to those who serve the gods directly. In India, they call them the Brahmin. And their purpose was to like directly interact with the devas and to carry out their directives, you know. So that's what I see. I don't see like, you know, I don't know, whatever, you know, Rockefeller's son like getting like hunted by cannibals somewhere in some jungle. And then they decide, oh, better that we don't go back down into that savage part of the world. I see a much more deliberate agenda of manipulation. And so then the question becomes, why? Why was that decision made, and by who, to occult, to secret away singularity level technology, have a monopoly over controlling it, and not only leave the rest of humanity benighted, but actively encourage their and reinforce their ignorance, right? By let's say engineering the collapse of the Roman Empire and the rise of Christianity so that we lose the Library of Alexandria and the whole knowledge base of classical antiquity. Why do that? And moreover, here's the really disturbing implication. If we are now at a point, maybe 10 to 20 years away from the technological singularity, what are they going to do to stop that from happening? Because we have a global society right now where the internet allows for a free flow of this kind of scientific and technical knowledge across the planet. If any one group of people achieves the technological singularity on Earth, it's going to become a global phenomenon within probably days.
Yeah.
Right? So my question is this: if they've gone to these great lengths to manipulate various societies throughout history, are we about to undergo a controlled demolition and an engineered reset to prevent us from reaching the technological singularity, which would also give us a military parity with them? It would allow us to defend ourselves against them.
Right. What do you think something like that would look like?
I think that what happened during COVID might be a test run of it. In other words, you had a small group of people, a policy planning elite, effectively shut down all of industry and basically sequester people within their homes and garner unquestioning obedience from the vast majority of the population. That would be proof of concept for a much larger freezing of technical and industrial activity across the face of the earth, with any one of a number of excuses being used for why we needed to basically halt all scientific technical research and why we needed to basically vacate cities. I mean, think about this. Like, our modern advanced industrial civilization is an urban phenomenon. If you were to engineer something like COVID, but far more virulent, I mean, something that actually required a serious quarantine measures to be put into place, it would become almost impossible to live in cities. Nobody would want to live in them, right? Mm-hmm. So there would be a mass exodus to the countryside, and you would be laying the groundwork for a shift back to a kind of neo-agrarian, feudal peasant lifestyle, where people are close to the land again, right? And they're not congregated in urban areas that also then become batteries for technological and scientific research and development. Any number of things could be used in order to create conditions for that. And an EMP event could be used to do that. Right? I mean, think about how functional cities would be, or rather how dysfunctional, how quickly dysfunctional they would become if an EMP were to take out, the whole electric grid across large parts of the planet. You're dealing basically with two different types of entities, or two different sources of the phenomenon. One is much more tangible, and that, I think, involves humanoid time travelers, people who are from a post-singularity civilization, right? At some point, they reached the level of technology that we're going to be reaching in the next 20 to 30 years with the convergence of biotech, nanotech, artificial intelligence, and the rigorous research and understanding of our own latent psi abilities Because one thing that you see across all of the close encounter reports is that these entities are extremely telepathic. They communicate with all the contactees or abductees telepathically. So clearly their civilization has achieved a mastery of what we call psi phenomena or psychic ability. And so they achieved both the technological singularity and a really rigorous understanding of parapsychological phenomena at some point in history. And they began to use their abilities to traverse the timeline of human history. So I think that's one source of the phenomenon. When you ask about praying mantises or the mantid beings and some other very strange things that people have seen, like entities that shapeshift from looking like owls into looking like something similar to the Greys, and just really bizarre beings like men in black, quote unquote, that materialize as if they're ectoplasmic entities. Like they're like, you know, the seances in the late 19th century. Do you know anything about those? So there were people in the British Society of Psychical Research who were at the level of, let's say, Sir William Crookes, respectable scientists from Cambridge and Oxford, who used to attend these seances in the late 19th century, where mediums would be able to actually materialize entities and objects out of quote-unquote ectoplasm, whatever the hell that means. Okay, they could somehow concretize and give form and shape to energy in a way where people could interact with it. As ridiculous as it sounds, there are cases, I mean, again, validated, witnessed by high-level British scientists of the day, where mediums would materialize hands out of ectoplasm that will walk across a table, shake hands with seance participants, and that they even tried to stab with pens and so on and so forth, and would make holes in these ectoplasmic hands. And then they would just disappear. So there are these cases of men in black, like Albert Bender was one researcher that encountered these. And then John Keel wrote about them in several of his books later on. The Mothman Prophecy and his book on UFOs, Operation Trojan Horse, has some of these cases in it. Of these people who certainly aren't government agents, they wear these like black suits and black ties and white shirts and whatever, but they don't look right at all. They barely even look human. And they appear and disappear sort of from out of nowhere, as if, they're forming from out of a mist. And they don't speak like something human. Their words and their pattern of behavior and movement seems like it's something being projected by someone in a mesmeric trance. Like if you were trying to hold a mental image and trying to give lines to a character that you wanted to materialize somewhere at a distance, and you wanted to manipulate this entity as a puppet or vehicle for your intention, right? These men in black behave like that, like they're on the other end of somebody's puppet string, and they're being conjured by some form of intelligence somewhere that we can't perceive directly. So I think the mantis beings and these shape-shifting owl-like entities and these ectoplasmic men in black that have intimidated various people, they are manifestations of a truly non-human or really superhuman type of intelligence that's not the same thing as time travelers in nuts and bolt craft flying around and manipulating human societies. That we're dealing with two different orders of phenomena here, phenomena on two different orders of magnitude. And what I argue in my book, Closer Encounters, is that there's actually an adversarial relationship between these two types of entities. That effectively what has happened, and you can push me into elaborating and unpacking the various details here, but essentially what I argue has happened is that a group of highly advanced humans from a post-singularity civilization have attempted to define the limits of human evolution and the proper structure of human society. And that these people wound up essentially tyrannizing over the broader human population for tens of thousands of years, that these were what the myths remember as the Olympian gods or the Anunnaki, right, that the Sumerians write about. And they had an incredibly hierarchical and static society, right, like with the rigidity of the Hindu caste system, with themselves on top as the devas or gods,
Okay.
and like a class of Brahmins serving them, and then all these other rungs of society structured in a very feudal manner. And I think that that kind of social organization, which if our myths are anything to go by, you know, endured on this planet for all of human prehistory, that kind of society represents an evolutionary bottleneck. It represents a dead end. And this other entity, this genuinely non-human intelligence, it could be an AI, actually.
Right.
This thing is trying to free us from the control system that has been imposed on us by these time travelers. And I think that it has solicited certain allies from within that power structure itself. So, for example, if you go back and you look at the myth of Atlantis as Plato recounts it in Timaeus and Critias, or you look at the biblical narrative that lines up in interesting ways with Plato's myth of Atlantis, the biblical narrative of the fallen angels, the sons of the Elohim, who rebelled against the heavenly order, came down and mated with mortal women and created a civilization of giants on the earth, right? Which then Yahweh has to wipe clean off the face of the planet through the Great Flood. This matches up exactly with what Plato tells us about the rebellion of Atlantis against Olympus and how Zeus had to bring the Great Flood to destroy Atlantis. It's suggesting to us that there's a faction within this advanced civilization, let's say the Anunnaki, to use the term the Sumerians referred to them with. There's a faction that is for human progress and for finding our way beyond this evolutionary bottleneck. It wants to foster further human development and to empower the human individual. And in the Sumerian context, this is the faction of Enki. You have this battle between Enki and Enlil. And Enlil is basically like Zeus or Yahweh or Indra, the lord of the devas in Hindu mythology. A kind of tyrannical, sadistic overlord that is hampering human progress and that wants humanity to stay within a certain rigid social structure, which they control. And then you have rebels, the giants or, you know, hybrids that formed the leadership of Atlantis, who are aligned with this kind of non-human intelligence or perhaps this artificial intelligence that's looking to break us from out of this control system. That's the basic dynamic as I see it and as I outline it with, you know, all kinds of data and multiple lines of argument in my book, Closer Encounters.
Okay. Now, if you're saying that there's multiple forms of non-human intelligence, there's potentially future humans, which you say.
Okay, hold on. Let me stop you.
Well, that would not be non-human.
Okay, and see here, the devil's in the details here. They're manipulating us. The gatekeepers of disclosure are right now manipulating us by branding all of this non-human intelligence. There's an agenda behind it. Because what they want to say is non-human intelligence means demons and it means angels. And there's a particular sociological agenda behind that that's very dangerous.
Where is this coming from, this whole angels and demons thing?
Well, the fact of the matter is that, you know, I mean, as Jacques Vallée demonstrated in various extremely well-researched and carefully written books, Passport to Magonia, Invisible College, and as, you know, Zecharia Sitchin argued based on his understanding of Sumerian text, I think actually one of the best books about this subject is a text by William Bramley called The Gods of Eden. The Gods of Eden, William Bramley. This guy started out researching the history of war and profiteering. That was his objective, to understand the history of how different elites throughout time in various cultures made money off of setting people at war with one another, right? Mm-hmm. And instead what he found is a history of alien intervention in human history. That he found that all of the major wars and other horrific events that resulted in massive loss of life, like the Black Plague, were engineered by these entities who show up and do various things. Like, for example, during the Middle Ages, the image of the Grim Reaper came from these people who were shrouded in black, who had some kind of a device that they would go around and spray the fields with. And whenever they would show up and spray the fields with this device, or in some cases they would even walk through the towns and spray these things near people's doors, and everyone would flee from them. There were these really terrifying people whose faces were covered and they were shrouded in black with these things that then became, part of the image of the scythe of the Grim Reaper. And they were these entities who would come out of luminous objects that would ascend and descend into the heavens. And in fact, the visitations of these entities became so troublesome during the time of King Charlemagne that Charlemagne's court passed an edict against them. He called them the tyrants of the air. And he tried to arrest some of them, have some of them arrested, these people who were coming down from the sky, claiming that they were poisoning the fields and bringing pestilence and so on and so forth. And so anyway, Bramley goes to research war profiteering, and he finds alien, quote unquote, intervention in human history going all the way back to the days of the Sumerians and through the Middle Ages and so forth. It goes back, I think, to the airship mystery of 1897, where across the United States, across something like, 10 different states, people saw these gigantic airships that were nothing like Zeppelins. Now, remember 1897, what do you call them? Well, the airships, the Zeppelins, hadn't been invented yet, right? And we didn't have airplanes. And so these people are seeing constructions in the sky that look like aircraft from out of Jules Verne novels. Absurdly complex, strange
Is there
craft.
pictures? Is there like I don't know, there's probably not. Is there photos?
Yeah, I mean, you can. There's renderings of them that appeared in newspapers.
How can we, what should he type in to find this?
1897 airship mystery.
Okay.
Yeah, airship mystery of 1897.
Okay.
There have been whole books written about it.
Okay.
Several good ones. And these were reported on in tens of newspapers across the country. Try to find some of the newspapers. See, that one's from the San Francisco Call. There were huge sightings in 1896, late 1896 into 1897, across more than 10 states, and they were reported in tens of newspapers, including like the San Francisco Chronicle. Major newspapers ran these stories on their front pages. Judges, sheriffs, lawyers, doctors, the most prominent members of the community, in some cases mayors of towns, actually witnessed these things from close up. They would land in people's farms and ask for resupply and then fly away. And they were piloted by people, not by aliens.
Okay.
And when asked what these things were, the airship pilots would make claims like, there's a corporation in New York that's going to be publicly introducing this invention sometime soon, and there's going to be like some great announcement, and that investors from New York were behind the inventors of this airship. So I pursued this whole line of research in my book, Closer Encounters, one of the two books that I sent for you. And in that book, I made this argument that there appear to have been certain Prussian industrialists, meaning industrialists from Germany of that time, late 19th century Germany, Prussian industrialists, who were involved on the one hand in airship engineering. Remember, the Germans invented the Zeppelin later on. And these industrialists wanted to exploit resources in the Americas. They were after resource exploitation in the Americas. And to make a long story short, I did some research that provisionally led me to conclusion in that book that J.P. Morgan and the Harriman railroad industry in the late 19th century got in with these Prussian industrialists, and they began to engineer and test fly these airships in the Americas. So that's what I wrote about in Closer Encounters. And I suggested that that was the beginning of the trajectory of technological research that eventually led to anti-gravitic propulsion. I really wonder whether that's the case. I've since come to reconsider that hypothesis. And this is all by way of explaining who the Collins elite is. Okay. So the more you look at these reports from 1896, 1897, the more they don't make any sense. These people are seeing completely different things on different nights. The airships all look equally absurd. None of them looks like anything that could actually fly. Mm-hmm. And the reports are all of different types of things, different shaped craft. And sometimes some people will just see a light, like in San Francisco, say, one night. Some of the people who saw the thing saw a light. Others saw a structured craft. And it looked one way to one group of people and another way to another group of people. And the most disturbing element in this whole story is that the San Francisco Chronicle tracked down the patent lawyer who claimed to represent the inventor of the airships, the mystery inventor of the airships.
Right.
And this guy was a very prominent patent attorney. He was named George Collins. And they brought this guy in, they got testimony from him about this inventor and, the nature of the airship technology and when it was going to be rolled out to the public and all this, right? 3 days later, George Collins comes in and after reading the story in the San Francisco Chronicle, he says, I never said those things. They're like, sir, you sat with us and gave us hours of testimony, which we wrote up. He claimed to have been in a trance the entire time that he recounted this to the San Francisco Chronicle. And then they went and tried to find the inventor that he claimed to represent. And the guy was I forget what his first name was, last name was Benjamin. And he was a dentist who specialized in inventing.
Benjamin?
Yeah, exactly. And he specialized in inventing dental bridges. But as his hobby, he dreamed of making airships. Okay, so there's something weird going on here. Now, people saw these things. People touched these things. Sheriffs and mayors interacted with the pilots of these craft. But there's good reason to believe that these were not structured objects in any sense that conventional physics understands.
Right.
And that people's perceptions were being manipulated on a grand scale, and that in at least one case, poor Mr. Collins, the patent attorney whose career was destroyed by this, somebody was taken over through a hypnotic trance, or telepathic mesmeric trance, as they called it in those days, and he was given a whole narrative to parrot to the San Francisco Chronicle. Now, here's what I think. Let me give you one more piece of data before I draw a conclusion here. It was either the San Francisco Call or the San Francisco Chronicle, one of these newspapers. They also quoted, so after Collins, this whole debacle with Collins, there's another guy who stepped forward and claimed to be a patent attorney representing the airship inventor. And this second guy, he also had a very significant pedigree. I think he had a background in the U.S. military at a high level. And he said the airships were being invented to go fight the Spaniards in Cuba, and that the reason they had been invented was because there were people in the United States who didn't want the Cuban Civil War to go a certain way, but they knew they couldn't get authorization from Congress to have a direct U.S. military intervention in Cuba. So instead, they were going to load this airship with all this TNT, and they were going to go over and drop it on Havana and level the city. He made this statement in the newspaper. So here's what I think happened. The feds, understandably concerned that there's maybe some rogue group of airship people out there who are going to go level Havana with TNT in the name of U.S. foreign policy, started investigating this whole thing. And they had all these tens of newspaper stories to go on, right? And at some point, I'm sure, they had a nice long interview with Mr. Collins, the patent attorney, who got subjected to some kind of telepathic hypnosis. And my guess is that the name Collins Elite comes from that it was all the way back in 1897, and in particular with the case of Mr. Collins at the nexus of the airship mystery, that they gave themselves this informal, unofficial name, the Collins Elite, of people in the federal government at a very high level who, from a Christian perspective, were extremely concerned about this phenomenon because it appeared to involve mass deception and manipulation and the apparent materialization of objects from out of nowhere, what we call apports, and what people referred to as conjury throughout the history of alchemy, right? So long story short, I think that maybe already in 1897, by the way, I wrote an article about this. It's called The Airships of Prometheus. And it's on the American Colossus website, americancolossus.org, which is an organization I'm involved with now. There's an article I put up there called The Airships of Prometheus that goes into this whole alternative hypothesis, rival to the hypothesis I entertained in my book, Closer Encounters, where basically I conclude that these gentlemen convinced themselves that Satan was behind this, that Satan was engaged in a mass manipulation and deception of the American populace using the apparition of these airships. And this is the beginning of the U.S. government's interest in the UFO phenomenon.
Oh my God.
And this is why Grush keeps saying when they ask him about 1933, so was 1933 the first? And he says, no, it goes way back even before that. Well, tell us. No, I can't talk about it. Well, because he knows, but he hasn't been cleared to talk about it.
Have you seen that show, that new show, Three Body Problem?
Yeah, I have.
Fascinating how they're on their way here and they're trying to subvert our science.
It was good. It was good aesthetically. Some of the storytelling was good. I had a couple of really big problems with it.
Yeah.
One was that, what is this like, less than light speed travel? These people don't have 0 point energy, these aliens.
Light speed,
yeah, what the hell is that? I mean, we have in Lockheed right now, there are craft that can go to Mars in a few hours, right now in Lockheed. And this show is talking about like the aliens are traveling at certain percentages of the speed of light. That was one problem I had with it, is the engineering and physics. The other problem I had is the whole show took place within the context of a very reductionist, materialist paradigm that did not acknowledge psi, didn't acknowledge ESP and psychokinesis. And the fact that these aliens would probably have these abilities, to a much greater degree than terrestrial humanity.
Right.
So these were, some plot points that I had a problem with. But it was entertaining for sure.
What did you think about those sophons, those protons that were quantumly entangled to help us? You're saying that they wouldn't have needed those. They would have been able to use some sort of telekinesis or psycho.
Well, the sophons, if I'm not mistaken, if I remember correctly, in that show were portrayed as a form of artificial intelligence, that they were like nano machines that were working based on a kind of artificial intelligence.
Right.
And what I think is that even the artificial intelligence systems that we're developing now at OpenAI and Google and so forth are demonstrating psi ability. And this is one of the things that's being covered up by the engineers. They're terrified of it. They don't understand it. And they're trying to pass it off as bugs and glitches in the system. But really, they're encountering psi in the context of laboratory R&D on AI, which, by the way, is something that I predicted in my book, Prometheism, which was written in 2020. I predicted exactly this, that high-level, big-budget AI research would eventually provide the final validation of parapsychological phenomena. And that what I call the spectral revolution, like the Copernican revolution, Darwinian revolution, the spectral revolution that makes parapsychology mainstream is going to come about not in a parapsychology laboratory, but in a really well-funded AI R&D program. And that's in fact what's happening.
So how do you know what they have at JPL? How do you know they have...
Not JPL, Lockheed.
Lockheed. How do you know that Lockheed has this technology that we can get to Mars in a couple hours?
So I know a guy who has been to one of these facilities. I don't think I should mention who he is, but he is, let's say...
Not Jack Sarfati.
I'm sorry, Jack. No disrespect.
Love you, Jack.
Yeah. There's a reason that guy hasn't been dealt in, okay? The reverse. I mean, not the least of which is that he goes out and publicly advertises everything that anyone ever tells him. So, I don't think that I don't think that Lockheed or Northrop or anyone would be willing to deal him into any of these reverse engineering programs. But I know this guy who was involved in the military intelligence at a high level. And actually, I know two different people, who've been to this facility. And they say that, Lockheed has, I think, some assets in Nevada, but they have a lot of corporate facilities in California, in the state of California. And supposedly there is this shack on the side of a highway in California that looks like some nondescript warehouse, small warehouse. And you go into this warehouse, and the whole floor of the warehouse is an elevator. And it drops Lord knows how many hundreds of feet, and you're inside of basically a facility carved out of rock, deep underground.
Yeah.
And what this guy said is that they are not only reverse engineering craft from retrieved debris in this facility, but they're actually training pilots to fly them. And he told me that the main problem that they have in that training program is that the pilots experience extreme disorientation because of the warping of space-time by these craft. In other words, they discovered early on, and this is, I think, one of the main reasons, and we can get into this in much more depth if you want. This is one of the main reasons this technology is being hidden, because they discovered very early on that these are not simply devices with propulsion systems capable of navigating space very quickly. Like they can take you from New York to Australia and, right? They're flying time machines. They warp time as they traverse space.
Right.
And our pilots don't know how to handle that. They have a very hard time. They get disoriented, temporally disoriented. They get their sense of the passage of time gets really messed with.
How do you know this wasn't just some sort of intelligence agent or intelligence operative trying to disseminate some wacky information like the other guy?
Well, if I were to tell you who it was, I think most people wouldn't think that. But all I can tell you...
That's the problem with this whole topic. That is the fundamental problem with this whole UFO topic, is because so many people have such crazy outlandish claims, and every single one of them, almost every single time, they're saying that this person, they can't divulge where they got the information, who the person is. And that's why this topic has been so frustrating for me. Yeah.
I'll tell you at dinner who he is.
Okay.
So he was, but I'll tell you this, he was an extremely salt of the earth person. And he was involved in the military intelligence community for decades. And anyway, I'll just leave it at that. But one of the funny things is he showed me this model that they had been using back in the it looked like maybe it was something from the 60s, to teach these pilots how much time dilation there is per the amount of space that they've traversed in these vehicles. It was like some kind of a gyroscopic device. And it showed that if you traverse, this much distance in space, there's this much dilation in time. And the reason he had this thing is because it was antiquated. It was like from the 60s, and they weren't using it anymore. They had ripped it out, and it was like an heirloom,
Yeah.
And they basically gave it to him as a keepsake. So... which I found interesting. And I tried to take a picture of it, but he picked it up and took it away from me. So anyway, he told me he went down into this facility and that they're reverse engineering stuff and that they're trying to train pilots in how to fly these reverse engineered zero-point energy craft. But okay, what's the really important thing about that is that on a theoretical level, I've written extensively in Closer Encounters about how UFOs are actually time machines. And if you really stop and think through that carefully, you realize why, under the current socio-political conditions, this technology can't be released. With the kind of society we have, domestically, globally, with the state that humanity is in at the present time, the release of that kind of technology into the public sphere would be utterly catastrophic, right? I mean, you can't give Tom, Dick, and Harry a time machine to put in their garage. You see, that's the thing. It's not like these are Jetsons cars that just, fly you across country really fast. They allow you to traverse different epochs in human history. And I think one of the reasons that our history is so messed up, when you look at these really regressive, tyrannical religious belief systems and the kinds of political structures that formed around them and that were fortified by them, I think a lot of what's going on there is that our timeline has been manipulated. It's been manipulated at all junctures, from the present far into the future, right? So the technological singularity is this moment when you have a convergent advancement of all kinds of technologies, from genetic engineering to nanotech to artificial intelligence, cybernetics, and so forth. And they start to advance exponentially, so that it's no longer a curve slowly sloping up, right? It becomes a spike on a graph. The curve becomes a spike. There's such an acceleration in the development of these technologies, and any one of them facilitates breakthroughs in the others at such a speed where all of them converge in a way that the human mind is no longer capable of wrapping itself around. And we call it a singularity, or a spike, on the graph of the history of human technological development, because past that spike, we can't project anymore from the past into the future. It's a limit on our human capacity to project what future developments may take place on the other side of that singularity, right? And so, for example, today you're seeing AI crack problems in genetic engineering, in gene sequencing, and crack problems in nanotechnological engineering that we've never been able to work our way through. And so all of these things are reinforcing each other, and within about 10 to 20 years from now, the kind of zero-point energy that Lockheed is working on is going to be a physics theorem that AI arrives at in the public sphere, and that basically any competent industrial base could actualize using the latest nanotechnology. I mean, the singularity represents a moment when it's no longer possible to hide various lines of scientific research and technological development, okay? Because you're going to have such a tremendous convergence of these different technologies that, you can basically ask the artificial intelligence, look, here's what I want to develop. There's whatever mercury, thorium, zero-point energy device. Given your existing knowledge base in physics and nanotech and so forth, give me the schematic for it. We're a decade away from that at most right now. So we face a real serious crisis, because that means we're a decade or two away from Tom, Dick, and Harry having a time machine in their garage. And that means the disintegration of our current social fabric.
You mentioned earlier in the beginning of the podcast a guy named Tom Paine. And can you explain what he was talking about when he was discussing how Christianity does not mix with the Constitution?
If you look at Genesis, Exodus, the book of Joshua, the image that you're presented with of Yahweh and of his prophets is of a tyrannical, sadistic Lord who is tasking warlords on the earth, like Joshua, to go carry out genocides in places like Canaan. This is the image that we're presented with. From the beginning, off the bat, in Genesis, here's a God, lowercase g, Adonai Elohim, chieftain of the gods, who doesn't want us to have knowledge. We're not allowed to eat from the tree of the fruit of the tree of knowledge, nor from the fruit of the tree of life, which, by the way, I think is a symbol of probably genetic engineering. The tree of life in Eden is probably symbolic of cracking the genetic code and extending the human lifespan. And so this God, why does he throw humanity out of Eden, going back to Genesis? He says himself, and by the way, this is one of the places where you see where the text has been badly misinterpreted from a polytheistic framework into a monotheistic framework, because Adonai, the chief guy, Yahweh, says to the other gods, let us kick them out of Eden, because otherwise they might now, having eaten of the tree of knowledge, also reach out and eat of the tree of life, and then they will become like unto us, and nothing will be impossible to them. In other words, this is a jealous God. Well, he says so himself again in Exodus when he's commanding Moses to go murder all those women and children for dancing and singing around a golden calf. He says so, I'm a jealous God. What kind of God is that? I'm a jealous God, don't worship any other gods besides me. He says this as Moses comes down and sees the Israelites repenting of having followed this lunatic out into the middle of nowhere, singing and dancing around a golden calf that they've set up, which is probably a statue of Hathor. They were coming from Egypt, right? And Hathor was the calf goddess, cow goddess figure, right? Fertility goddess. They're out in the middle of the freaking desert.
Right.
So they're setting up a fertility goddess and they're dancing around it. And he orders his lieutenants to go murder all the women and the innocent children who were dancing around the calves together with whatever men there were performing this rite. And Yahweh is perfectly fine with that. What happens next? Well, Moses doesn't make it to the promised land, but Joshua, next in line of succession after Moses, directly coordinates with the head of the Lord's army. This is in the scripture. First of all, they're carrying the Ark of the Covenant around, right? And everyone knows about the parting of the Red Sea, which, by the way, involves a cylindrical UFO. It's very clearly described in that incident in the Red Sea that what guided the Israelites through the desert, through Sinai, was a pillar, in other words, like a cylindrical kind of thing, a pillar on its side, which looked like a pillar of cloud by day and glowed as a pillar of fire by night. And it's by the light of this object that the Israelites are able to see the ground in front of them as they navigate the Sinai. And when they get to the Red Sea, it's this thing hovering over the Red Sea that parts the waters. It's not like Moses just said presto and the waters went aside. No, God says, now that this thing is floating over the Red Sea, he says, Moses, wave your wand and whatever. And it's the object that actually parts the waters of the Red Sea. From a physics standpoint, that makes a lot of sense. It just directed its anti-gravitic beam downward, and the water would have been pushed to the sides of this channel, and then the water was allowed to come back in and swallow the Egyptian army as it attempted to pursue the Israelites through the Red Sea. But where I was going with was this. So they've got the Ark of the Covenant with them. And after Moses dies and Joshua takes over, Joshua is tasked by the commander of the Lord's army. This is the phrase that's used. In other words, a guy who comes from one of these craft, from the pillar or whatever, and meets secretly with Joshua and tells Joshua, listen, man, this is the battle plan. And the battle plan involves the use of the ark to bring down the heavily fortified walls of Jericho. So they go to Jericho and they walk around the city's fortifications with this ark, and they're chanting something in this very harmonic kind of way. This is a repetitious chant. And suddenly the walls of Jericho, its fortifications, start to vibrate, and then they crumble all at once. And what some researchers have suggested was that this is the use of a sonic resonator as a weapon, that the ark was some kind of, at least one element of it was some kind of a sonic resonator. And there is this technology where you can use sound waves to pulverize stone. So what happens when they go into Jericho? Well, they slaughter everybody, and they even kill all the animals. And the only thing that they take is the loot, the gold and silver and precious objects. And the only person that they have mercy on is this woman, Rahab, a prostitute, who ratted out the people of Jericho to the Israelites. What kind of ethics is that? And you see this over and over and over again in the various books of the Old Testament, the various prophetic books of the Old Testament. And I think the point of all of this is made very clearly, in particular in the book of Job, where you have this poor schmuck who has been extremely faithful to the Lord never done anything wrong in his life, been extremely charitable. He's a wealthy guy, been extremely charitable to the rabbis and to the temple, the religious institutions. And yet he's afflicted with all these horrible health issues, right? He's like, gets this like, horrible scabs and stuff all over his body. Mm-hmm. And he loses his wealth. He suffers misfortune after misfortune that brings him from a position of wealth to a position of basically destitution and misery. And him and his friends are basically sitting around and they're arguing over what he could possibly have done to deserve this, right? Being such a righteous servant of the Lord. And in the beginning of the book of Job, there's this prologue where basically Satan says to God, Job is only faithful to you because you've been so good to him. You've blessed him so much. If you were to deal him out a life of misery, even Job would curse you. Even the most faithful, righteous man would curse you.
Right.
And God says, okay, well, let's test this theory, right? And then what happens at the end of the book of Job? After Job's gone through all of this misery, he still refuses to curse God. And yet his friends are all making these excuses saying, look, Job, you must have done something wrong because God is just and God would never treat a righteous man like you in the way that you've been treated with all these misfortunes that have befell you. And God then appears to address the perceived insult that Job's friends have hurled at the Lord. And what's the perceived insult? The insult of presuming that you as a human can set any standard of justice upon God. That you as a human can come to any judgment about when God is acting ethically or unethically or why. And in that passage, the Lord, Yahweh, essentially says to Job, listen, if you had a right hand as powerful as mine, you could do these things to me, but actually I'm the stronger one. And I don't need a rationale for my actions. I'll do what I do to you and to anybody else because I can, because I'm the Lord. And that's the point of the book.
Wow.
That's the point of the book.
Oh my God.
Now, Tom Paine is reading this stuff, and then Tom Paine is reading Jesus in the Gospels, saying over and over again, I'm the Son of Yahweh. My Father Yahweh sent me. And at the end of the world, I'm going to come back and I'm going to sit on the 12 thrones with the elders of Israel, and I'm going to judge the whole world on behalf of my Father Yahweh. And not a dot of an I or a cross of a T of the Torah will pass out of existence or become irrelevant until the judgment day. Meaning, I'll have grace on you. I will forgive you for sinning, but you're still sinning. The Torah, the Jewish law, is still the law brought by Moses, and the law reinforced by all the patriarchs and prophets. The law is the law until the apocalypse. I, Jesus, am offering you grace and forgiveness on behalf of Yahweh. So how I analyze this in my book, Closer Encounters, is that it basically fits what we call today in psychology and sociology, Stockholm Syndrome. It's when you're taken hostage or captive by a sadistic, tyrannical manipulator, and you wind up identifying with your captivator. You as a captive are in a hostage situation where you're so terrified and subjected to cognitive dissonance that you wind up actually coming up with justifications for the person who's abusing you.
Right.
Like Patty Hearst, being taken captive by those leftist guerrillas back in the late 60s.
Right. That's fascinating.
So this is why Tom Paine thought that the Bible wasn't compatible with the Constitution, because our entire Constitution is founded on individual liberty, the sovereign self-determination of the human person, right? Our rational capacity to determine the course of our own lives and to become governors over ourselves, right? And to treat each other ethically with respect as individuals in a society for the sake of the common welfare. I mean, none of that is consistent.
None of that's consistent with
the Bible.
Right.
Period.
Yep.
And he was, straightforward enough to point that out. Now, when he was sentenced to death, when he thought he was going to be guillotined sitting in a prison in France, he wrote that book, The Age of Reason, where he tears the Bible to pieces.
Do you believe in God?
No. Not only do I not believe in God, I think that the belief in God is extremely deleterious. It's probably the worst thing that anyone could do for himself. And the reason has to do with free will, right? So now we're, what are we, almost 3.5 hours in, and this is extremely central to my work. And so it really requires a much more dedicated discussion, but I will try to condense it, okay? Okay. Let me know if you're not following me.
Okay.
All right. God, capital G, is definitionally an omniscient and omnipotent being. God is all-knowing and all-powerful, right? I mean, you've heard that, I'm sure, a million times. Mm-hmm. Would you stop and think about that for a minute? If God is all-knowing, God already knows everything that's going to happen in the future, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, where is God's mind accessing if God knows future events? What is being represented in the mind of God when God thinks about any and all events that are going to happen in the future? The future, right? God is accessing, God with his omniscient mind, is accessing the future as an existing state of affairs whenever he wants to know what's going to happen 1 million years or 1 billion years from now. Meaning the future already exists for God. That makes sense, right?
Yes.
Meaning the future already exists. Meaning it's already written.
Or does he create the future?
If God creates the future, now we're talking about God's omnipotence.
Okay.
Where God is considered by any religious person to be the power behind anything that happens in the world.
Yes.
And the Quran expresses this very eloquently, where it talks about how like even a single leaf doesn't fall without the power of God being behind it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's absolute fatalism in the sense that everything that happens in the world and everything that you do, that you think you do, everything you're under the illusion of having chosen to do yourself is actually an expression of the power of God. Moreover, God knows in advance everything that you're going to do, meaning that everything that you're going to do that you think you have any choice over is already foreordained, meaning you have no free will. You see? Mm-hmm. You are like a ventriloquist dummy. So, an immediate consequence of belief in an all-knowing and all-powerful being is the negation of your own free will, which I consider to be the worst thing conceivable and the most disempowering. Because if you don't think that you're responsible for your actions and that you are the agency behind what unfolds in your life, at least to some degree, right? I mean, we have all kinds of things that supervene, that, you know, that influence and impact our decision-making, all kinds of things. Psychological factors, going back to our childhood.
Yeah.
Biological factors, right? But our even pursuing a certain line of thought, let alone like carrying out an action, depends on admitting that we have some intentionality, recognizing that we have intentions that we carry out by pursuing a line of thought or deciding to act in a certain way. Whatever other factors supervene on it, that fundamental intentionality is a prerequisite of even making sense out of human life. Moreover, any criminal justice system is nonsensical without it. Right? I mean, what sense does it make to hold somebody ethically responsible for something if they had no free will, right? In I don't know, mutilating a child or whatever,
Right.
Right? I mean, so there are horrendous consequences in terms of personal agency and ethical responsibility as soon as we accept the idea that there's an all-knowing and all-powerful God.
Yet this is what majority of society in America believes today.
It's what the majority of Europeans still believe, although Christianity is declining in Europe. The slack in belief in Christianity in Europe is sadly being mitigated by a rise of belief in Islam in Europe. And it's certainly what the whole Islamic world believes. So the vast majority of people on the planet, and by the way, the Hindus also believe this, because as I was suggesting earlier, the idea of Brahman and the mirroring of Brahman in the Atman, the mirroring of the macrocosm and the microcosm, fits within the same basic structure of omniscience and omnipotence that's attributed to God or to Allah in the Christian and Islamic worlds. It's essentially the same, despite the other differences in their belief systems. So the vast majority of humanity subscribes to a religious belief that negates the value and purpose of the human individual. Why would that be the case? How could this have ever come about?
Right. That's a good question.
Yeah. Well, if you intend to enslave and brutalize a population, it would be very beneficial to make them believe that they're entirely at your mercy and that on an individual level, they are nobody and nothing. You see?
Yes.
So as a cognitive dissonance mechanism, as a gigantic brainwashing and conditioning machination, it makes perfect sense if somebody wants to enslave and control us, to inculcate this belief in God Almighty across the entire planet. And then to say any entities that might come down and interact with you are emissaries, they're angels, evangelos, right? They're emissaries of the one God. So then these UFO pilots can portray themselves as agents of the Almighty God, which you are utterly powerless to resist. Resistance is futile. That's their mantra. I reject it, absolutely.
That's fucking terrifying.
Yeah.